Hey guys, so making another nightly diary entry. Today is November 27th, 2017. My last nightly diary, I just kind of rambled on for a while. I did ask people to comment if there was a specific subject in that video that anyone was interested in hearing me talk about in more depth, and since no one commented, and I have pretty much forgotten whatever the hell it was I was rambling about last time, I'm just gonna ramble on about whatever happens to be in my brain this time around. So now for my 10-minute rambling session. I took Thanksgiving weekend off of doing any sort of work because I had 2 different Thanksgiving dinners to go to, and, had to sort of try and manage my stress, I guess. Anyway, a little out of breath. But I've been having a good day today. Today's been nice. Been getting back to work on stuff, including my Sonic video game plot, which I am still writing. The plan for this so far is mostly just to write out the whole story in the form of sketching out each of the cutscenes in rough storyboards. From that point on, if I continue to get it further done into a comic format, I'm probably going to see if I can find another artist who can pick it up from there and work off of my storyboards to make the comic, rather than having to draw the whole thing myself. Heck, if I'm going to spend the time to draw a Sonic comic entirely on my own, I'd probably rather it be Reborn, since that's something that has a lot of nostalgic value on it, for me. Which, Reborn will probably get rebooted again. The last reboot was because I was working for a comic studio where my editor constantly scolded and reprimanded me for wasting my free time on fan fiction. But, and so I rebooted it and made a bunch of changes in the hopes that maybe he would be less grumpy about me working on it if it was something that he liked better. But all those changes ultimately made it a worse product because I don't think he ever understood the actual purpose of the comic. But then again, if you go back and you read the original pages of the comic, they're definitely not as good as the rebooted version in terms of, technical skill. The art's not as good, it's all on notebook paper, it's very rough, and some of the jokes work, some of them don't. It's also just a little bit too slow, but then again, the reboot has a problem of things being too fast. I think the thing is, though, after, at one point the other day, having a conversation with a friend of mine where we tried to create a version of the Sonic Forces plot that could happen in the Reborn universe, which, by the way, in the chronology of that universe, the Sonic Forces plot was placed in between what I refer to as the first and second arcs of Reborn. So it's at some point when Sonic is in his mid-30s and has kids. So the whole classic Sonic gets replaced with one of his daughters and other stuff. Anyway, point is, after going through this whole conversation, my friend made this comment, and he was like, I'm kind of surprised at how funny this all is coming out to be. Since Reborn is usually kind of dark and edgy, and so it's kind of funny how this dark, edgy comic ends up making what is, in theory, one of the darker Sonic plots into kind of a funny story. And I think that comment kind of ties in with this general sort of missing the point, I guess. And this is probably more a problem of me struggling to articulate to people sometimes what I'm trying to do with a story. A lot of times the best way for me to tell someone what I'm trying to do is to just show them the final product, rather than to try and describe the objective. I think one big problem with me is that when I describe my stories, I usually will describe the plot points or setting details and things that don't pertain to the jokes. I don't describe my own jokes. When I'm telling a story to someone or describing a story, I don't ever really describe what the comedy in that story is like, because most of my jokes can't be explained. A lot of my jokes, if I try to describe them to you with no visuals, don't sound very funny. What makes them funny is usually the visuals. I think a really good example of this would probably be this gag from the original Reborn comic, which got a lot of people laughing. This joke was Silver. And And yeah, without those visuals, if I just described this to you without the pictures, it would be a lot less funny, because you wouldn't get those facial expressions, which are kind of the punchline of the joke. And a lot of my humor is kind of visual like that, and so it's funnier if you actually see it than if I were to try and describe it to you. But since I usually am describing things like the basic plot structure, as well as significant scenes, like scenes that are really dramatic or move the plot forward in significant ways or are major character turning points, those scenes are all dramatic scenes, and so because those are the scenes I talk about, people get this impression that the whole comic is like that the whole thing is just going to be endless melodrama, which isn't really the case at all. If you go back and you read the original Reborn, you'll realize that a lot of that material was jokes. Yeah, there are serious moments, and there are harsh moments, but there's a lot of jokes in there. I think the thing about Reborn that is probably the best way for me to put it now, after years of trying to describe this comic to other people, I think probably one of the best ways I could describe it is actually kind of like being the Sonic version of the Mentally Advanced series. If you know what the Mentally Advanced series is with MLP, it's a parody series that's just for comedy in that case, where they essentially just take all the characters and create these sort of adult parodies of the kid-friendly characters from the show. And Reborn, while it's not strictly a comedy, it actually does do a lot of drama as well, is kind of similar. Both its comedy and its drama come from deconstructing the characters, and we get to see each of the characters sort of turned into this kind of, into these sort of, warped adult versions of the canon characters we're familiar with. That's not to say that their personalities are completely flip-flopped for no reason. Any characters the changes in their characters all make sense as a natural progression of the events within the story, but I think they're still kind of fun examinations nonetheless. Like Sonic, once he's rendered ugly, he loses his freedom, can't talk to his friends and family for a long time. Over the course of 10 years of being forced to work for somebody against his will, Sonic has grown into a very bitter, depressed individual. He still cracks jokes all the time, but his jokes have gone from mostly being kind of harmless or a little cheeky to being really kind of bitter and cynical. He's kind of an asshole, just in general, and a lot of other characters in the comic don't really like him, because he's an abrasive asshole. He's funny, but he's a jerk, and he's a jerk because he's depressed, and he cracks jokes to try and cover up the fact that he's horribly depressed and kinda hates himself. And his whole character arc in the comic deals with him learning how to overcome the shit that's happened to him, and learning, how to be a decent person again. The thing about this character arc, though, is that Sonic has kind of always been a little bit of an ass. The reality of it is, he didn't suddenly become a jerk. He's kind of always been a little bit like that. It's just that the Sonic we have currently is tempered by the presence of his friends and family, who help to soften him into a much nicer person. In this example, we see an adult version of Sonic whose jerky tendencies have been amped up to 11 due to all these negative things happening to him and the absence of the positive influence of his friends. So, yeah. Other characters are similar, where they'll take some element of the character and they'll show that element, and they'll show these different character elements being, becoming more prevalent aspects, I guess, based off circumstance. Much of this comic kind of examines how each of the characters has been affected by Sonic's absence in their life. The most interesting being Amy. Well, Tails is kind of interesting too, but I guess I'll talk about both of them. Tails in the comic is also kind of an asshole, but for wildly different reasons than Sonic. Sonic is mostly just a jerk because he's crude and crass and, makes pretty mean-spirited jokes and just generally doesn't really give a fuck, about much of anything. Tails is an ass for wildly different reasons, and his dickishness is not nearly so obvious. Tails is just very passive-aggressive, and Tails, as he's gotten older, has really sort of sunk into this whole I am the smartest person in the room mentality, and sort of treats everyone around him like they're morons. He constantly takes for granted that, how smart the people around him actually are. Tails, he constantly gets frustrated and disappointed when people seem to be unable to keep up with him on whatever subject. And after Sonic died, Tails kind of just became a recluse. He holed himself up in his house. He didn't really talk to anyone. I mean, he still did things like, when you have that obligatory must meet up around the holidays and stuff like that. But he spent pretty much all of his free time just holed up in his home, building shit and experimenting and stuff by himself. And he kind of adopted this mentality that it's safer to keep people at a distance because you'll either lose them or they will disappoint you. One of the two. And rather than face that, he figured, I am the only person I can trust, so I will just spend time in my own company. Tails also has adopted some pretty neurotic habits, as well as a surprisingly short temper. While he generally seems pretty calm I don't know if calm is the right word, polite in most public settings. Behind closed doors, he can be a bit of an ass, he can blow up at people. He also sometimes fantasizes about doing violent things to people, in a sort of comically over-the-top way. Like, there's a scene at one point, because I don't want to spoil too much, but Tails has a wife who's an alien, and there's a scene at one point where he's going to be getting an award for some scientific achievement of his, and a guy is at his house inviting him personally to the award ceremony, and dropping these offhanded comments about how Tails shouldn't bring his wife, because, the guy's kind of racist and thinks his alien wife is weird. And there's this moment where Tails grabs him by the back of his hair and smashes his head through the glass coffee table in front of him. And then it blips back to reality and you realize that was just a fantasy in his head as he gives some sort of passive-aggressive response instead. So yeah, Tails is kind of neurotic. He kind of hates people. And his character arc has a lot to deal with him learning to open up to people again after he got in the habit of shutting everyone out for such a long time. In the case of Amy, Sonic has a brother in this universe, and I know that the long-lost twin brother thing is a cliche is such a sort of soap opera cliche that it's comical, but his brother is actually important to his and Amy's character arcs. But after Sonic died, Amy dated his brother for a little while, because his brother was sweet and charming and nice to her, and he looked just like Sonic, and then she realized she was only really with him because she wasn't over losing Sonic, and, she was just kind of really in love with this fantasy of a version of Sonic who was actually nice to her consistently and reciprocated her feelings, and so she ended up dumping his brother because she felt like she was with him for the wrong reasons, and over the years, she kind of built herself up around this idea of distancing herself from Sonic and being, a strong, independent woman. She wanted to prove to herself that she didn't need Sonic in her life, that she was totally over him, and that, after having years to ruminate on it, she started to think that maybe Sonic was kind of an asshole, and that maybe she shouldn't have wasted so much time and energy and affection on someone who never reciprocated it. And so she feels kind of dumb and stupid for the way that she used to obsess over him when she was younger, and so she tried to distance herself from that part of herself as much as she could, and as a result, she ended up living a life in which she was kind of miserable. When we meet her in the beginning of the comic, she's working as a secretary at a fashion, like a fashion company or whatever, and she's kind of miserable. She's not miserable in, like, an overt way. She's just sort of, what's the right way to put this? Her life has just sort of become very mundane and tedious. She's single, she lives a decent distance away from most of her friends, and Cream, who has grown up in this period of time, has gone off adventuring and exploring the world and being an adrenaline junkie with her big, tough, scary boyfriend. And so, Amy ends up jumping into the conflict of the comic. She ends up joining Sonic before she knows that it's Sonic, because she wants an adventure, not because of any other real reason. She just wants some excitement in her life again, because everything's been pretty boring, and because she spent so much time distancing herself from that lifestyle that she's realized she really, really misses that. Those are the most significant characters. Knuckles is in this comic too, and he does get kind of a deconstruction, but Knuckles is the character who becomes very calm and level-headed as he gets older. So there's not a whole lot I can say, because he's not necessarily the most complex character in the comic, but rather he's kind of the one in the group that keeps everybody else grounded, and he kind of functions as a straight man to all of the either comedy or drama that he's playing off between the other characters, and can frequently be a pretty decent advice giver. I've talked through a lot of this, so I should probably wrap this up soon. I'll wrap up at the 20-minute mark. So yeah. But, that's the thing, I like the drama that Reborn presents, but I think I like the comedy just as much, if not more. It's just that I don't talk about those parts of the story when I'm describing it to other people, because I don't know how to really describe comedy. I mean, what am I supposed to say? If I'm trying to write something funny, how am I supposed to describe the thing to someone? And in all fairness, a lot of series that are strictly comedy shows don't really have very substantial plots. Think of some shows that you, right off the top of your head, that are comedies, and think about how the plot sounds if you describe it. In the case of this situation, I guess the thing for me is that, to me, a dramatic plot does not negate having jokes. In fact, I think jokes are even more important when your story is dramatic, because without the jokes, then the story becomes this constantly depressing, brooding slog. Jokes allow, laughter is a fantastic tool for a writer, for getting your audience invested in your characters, and I feel like comedy is a necessity to drama. Consider this a piece of writing advice. If you're going to write a dramatic story, you need levity. It has to be there. Your story will die without it. Without some levity, the tone becomes oppressive, and your audience suffers, what I guess TV tropes has termed darkness-induced apathy. People stop caring about the conflict because it feels like no matter what the characters do, they will always be miserable. Why should I care about their attempts to be happy when it's clear that that's never going to happen, because nothing happy ever happens in this series? And that's the thing, is you don't even need the moments of levity to necessarily be positive moments. You can have funny moments in which dumb shit or just annoying stuff is still happening and have it be funny. Like I said, a lot of Sonic's jokes in this comic are kind of dickish jokes to make, but despite that, they're still funny jokes, even if he is an asshole. If you have a character where a scene where two characters are fighting, you can make that funny. Yeah, they're fighting, but if they're fighting over something stupid, or hell, sometimes even if they're fighting over something serious, but the argument doesn't really matter for one reason or another later on, you can still make these scenes funny. In the original version of Reborn, when there's a scene when Amy invites Sonic over to her house, she goes to take a shower. And this whole scene is kind of presented like a joke, and if anyone's curious, the in-universe reason as to why Amy goes to take a shower is because she got rained on, right? But the meta reason as to why she goes to take a shower is because at the time I wanted an excuse to show Amy naked in the shower so that people knew this was going to be an adult comic. But the comic is pretty blatant about the fact that that's pretty much the only reason she's going to take a shower right now, is just so we can have an excuse to show her naked. And it cracks jokes with this scene. It does still move the plot along, but Amy overhears this, Sonic is out in the living room and fucking around, and he turns on the news, and Amy hears a news broadcast about a museum robbery, and the guy that's described on the news sounds suspiciously like the guy who's now in her living room. She pokes her head out the door, and Sonic makes some comment about, oh, come on, I practically posed for the camera. It's just kind of a funny little scene. It's a little bit dramatic, I guess, as Amy's just realized, oh shit, the guy I just let in my house was a criminal. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And she tries to call the police, and Sonic is standing on the other side of the door. It's like, you probably shouldn't do that. The thing is, I could have just as easily made this a tense and dramatic scene where Amy is, afraid for her life because she doesn't know if this criminal is violent or unstable, but that's not really how the scene is presented. Sure, Amy seems a little bit, she's not actually that shaken. She seems more annoyed when Sonic starts talking to her than she seems scared, to be perfectly honest. But the scene is played up for comedy rather than drama, because the audience, either at this point that that's Sonic, you've already figured it out, or B, you'll be figuring it out later, or be told that later, and when you are told that, the scene will be funny in hindsight. It's framed as a funny scene because while Amy is kind of scared, we, the audience, know that she's not in any danger. Sonic obviously isn't going to hurt her, so it's funny because she's freaking out over something that isn't actually a threat. That's why it's funny. Now, either you already get the joke in this scene because you've already figured out that that's Sonic, or if you're, haven't picked up on that yet, you'll be told that that's Sonic pretty much in, almost the next scene or two. So, if you don't already know, you'll know a little bit later, so, yeah. Most people I think a lot of people were able to figure out that that was Sonic around the time that the scene was going on, because there's plenty of kind of overt hints dropped. In the previous scene of Sonic dicking around in the living room, there were some hints dropped there. But, I know some people who didn't get it until I actually had Silver call Sonic out by name. So, sometimes I really debate with myself over how good Sonic's disguise, quote-unquote, needs to be. Part of the comedy and the drama in this comic comes from the fact that the other characters don't know that this is Sonic until later on, with each character figuring out at a different point in time and by different ways. Some characters figure it out on their own, some characters are told, but the last person to figure it out is, ironically, Tails, and yes, there is an explanation. He's not just stupid. It has to do with how his character's been written in the story, and it'll make sense in context, but there's a lot of jokes and a lot of drama that is pulled from the fact that they don't know who Sonic is. Hell, the whole basic concept behind Reborn, in terms of the basic idea that I started with, was I saw someone else's fanfic, A Dozen Years, which is a pretty good short comic. It's got really cute artwork. I forget the name of the artist off the top of my head. I will probably put a link to her in the description. But A Dozen Years took this premise of Sonic being missing for 12 years and coming back kind of scarred up and a little worse for the wear, and having to try and readjust to life readjust and find a new place in his friends' lives, particularly Amy. And when I read this comic, I couldn't help but think to myself, you could take this I read this and I thought, you could take this concept a step further. What if Sonic comes back and he is so scarred up and different than he was originally that people can't tell that it's him? And so that was the idea that this comic was built on, playing on the dramatic irony that the other characters don't know that it's Sonic. And so from their perspective, they're interacting with a new person and getting to know somebody new. We, the audience, know that it's Sonic, but they don't. And I guess the question then becomes, how different does he need to look and act in order for it to be believable that the characters don't get that it's him? I've had some people tell me that, oh, that's obviously Sonic, they'd have to be stupid not to tell. But then I also have other people who read the comic and couldn't even figure it out that it was him until it was spelled out for them. So I'm never entirely sure just how good Sonic's, redesign is for achieving that goal. There's also the fact, one of my friends brought up, wouldn't people recognize his voice at least? And then I mentioned, the last time they saw him, he was, 17. His voice has changed in the time between that. It's a lot deeper now, and it's also kind of raspy or whatever, because he's been chain-smoking for, 10 years. So he's got kind of this gravelly voice. Imagine Roger Craig Smith if he'd been chain-smoking for 10 years. I think that's probably the best way to put it. It's kind of over the period of time between when the last time his friends saw him and now, it's the transition from, Ryan Drummond to Roger Craig Smith, and then add chain smoking. So yeah, they're not going to recognize his voice anymore. Some of his hair is turned white, so, you know, that's going to throw you off too. And then there's all the scars. I guess at the end of the day, it's kind of a Clark Kent and Superman sort of thing. Like, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter too much. Like, even if Sonic still looks close enough that it's kind of obvious to the audience, I think it's convincing enough not to break your suspension of disbelief. I think at the end of the day, that the question doesn't have to be, can the audience can the audience tell that this is Sonic? Because if the audience can tell, that's fine. The audience is supposed to know anyway, so it doesn't matter if they can tell that it's him all too much. All I need to do is sell you on the idea that the other characters can't tell. And, you know, all things considered, I think that's not that hard of a thing for most people to accept. Especially when Sonic is, you know, doing things that are very uncharacteristic of Sonic, or at the very least uncharacteristic of the person that they knew Sonic to be once upon a time. He's still himself, he still has a lot of the same core character traits, but so many things have changed, I think it's not totally unrealistic that the others wouldn't be able to recognize him. There's also this factor that is especially prevalent with Tails, where they kind of hold on to this romanticized image of the person Sonic once was. Amy doesn't do this as much, because over time she's managed to kind of help to deal with grieving over Sonic by recognizing all of his flaws and all of the ways that he was kind of an asshole, so that she could feel, I guess, a little bit less bad about losing him. I mean, she still misses him, she doesn't hate him or anything, but that has kind of helped her to cope with, you know, losing him. Part of that was recognizing his flaws. But in Tails' case, part of the reason that Tails doesn't recognize that Sonic is Sonic and why he figures this out last, he's the last person to find out, and the reason for this is because Tails holds on to this very romanticized view of Sonic that the current Sonic that we see does not hold up to. And Tails holds on to this romanticized view because he spent much of his childhood living in Sonic's shadow. So on some level, there's this kind of justification that the only way that Sonic could possibly have been better than him or outshined him would be if Sonic was somehow amazing, or if he was somehow shitty and worthless, if that logic makes any sense. So if Sonic is kind of shitty and worthless, then in Tails' mind that means that he must be shitty and worthless because he'll never be as good as Sonic. So accepting that this guy, this depressed asshole, bad life choices, ugly motherfucker, is the guy who constantly showed him up and who was constantly this famous hero growing up, then what does that make Tails by comparison? Again, this is in his own mind. This is him and his own, you know, the way he sees himself and the way he rationalizes self-worth. He is a character who measures his self-worth in many respects off of his relation to other people. And that's also why he holds his intellect in such high regard, because to him, his intelligence is what makes him better than everybody else, and gives him some sense of self-worth. So yeah. I should probably wrap up now. It's almost 30 minutes. I said I was going to stop at the 20-minute mark, but I guess I'm going to stop, like, now, I guess. It's like 28 minutes. Alright, I'm really going to actually wrap up for real this time. I guess I'll just say goodnight, guys. I will talk to you later. I hope you enjoyed this rambling session.